One may well ask, what is a hero? We're playing a superhero role-playing game, so what is it to be heroic? And I bring it up because First Generation Champions is notable compared to all other role-playing games about this sort of thing in not saying what it is. There's one short section that says only the one common denominator is in some way, shape, or form helping people. That's it. It's left completely abstract and completely up to you and completely undefined in game text terms. This is pretty different from the contemporary superhero games. Villains and Vigilantes is very explicit. It's about upholding the law as well as love of country. And in case you were kind of wondering about either of those, the original Villains and Vigilantes includes the New York Penal Code in the back for reference. And then you have GURPS Supers a little bit later than the period that I'm talking about. And I bring this up, and Superworld is another good example because both of them are heavily Champions derived. And the difference, though, is that both of those games have much stricter rules about comportment. If you look at the rules of early Champions in regard to psychological limitations, you might be a little surprised at how non-binding they are. Whereas in GURPS Supers and in Superworld, they're much more binding on the players, kind of contractual. I will do this, I won't do that. And so Champions is quite interesting in that it doesn't define what a hero is, and it also allows for greater flexibility in terms of commitments about what your hero thinks. So then there are a couple of other games to mention, and they're significant because they're the ones that are licensed to the comics properties of the time. Marvel Superheroes, which is quite straightforward in this regard in certain ways. In that there is a reward system that is very clear about what you get karma for. Most of it is what you would expect, fighting villains, catching villains, taking villains to jail, notably spending time with loved ones and being very soap opera-y, as well as any wide number of other nice things. Making charity donations, interestingly, is in there. There are a couple of interesting nuances in that game, though. One of which is that villains have their own karma rewards if you're going to track villains as carefully as you are heroes, and I certainly would be tempted to do so in that game. Interestingly enough, villains also have to do, in fact, they're even under more pressure to do soap opera-y things than the heroes, which I think is very insightful regarding Marvel at that time. Another thing that's insightful regarding Marvel at that time is that you lose all your karma if you kill someone. But it's kind of interesting because you're spending your karma all the time, either for bonuses or for improvements. So if you think about it, if you've spent down to almost nothing and then waste somebody, shucky darn. And that may seem like the system's broken until you read Marvel comic books of, mid-1960s through the mid-1980s, and that's kind of what happens. So anyway, that's interesting, though. There is a morality built in with an interesting twist in Marvel Superheroes, characteristically as well in DC Heroes. The strictures are very straightforward. You pick what kind of hero you are in the beginning, you say what kind that is, and let's see, you got sort of Superman type, you got your Batman type, your Green Arrow type, and you've got, which at that time was more of a fun adventurer rather than another hardened vigilante. And then you have your cyborg type, the reluctant type. And there you go. You pick one, you play that thing, you're committed to doing it and not to deviate from it, and you came here to do that, and that's what you do. And then you have champions, which, don't get me wrong, I'm calling it the amoral system, not because it means, random destructive behavior. Amoral doesn't mean chaotic neutral. It means that the game itself gives you systemic tools, and then whatever you do with it, do you really find out what a hero is? You may or may not. You may find out what this hero is. Is your character a hero? They can be. They probably will be. But in what way and about what? Things like that. Champions almost very deliberately says, your table, your group, you go. We'll read your comic one day and we'll find out what you thought. This really is totally an artifact, in a good way, of the comics of the previous decade and a half before the publication of Champions. And particularly, all right, boring comics history time. 1968, Marvel, as part of Goodman Publications, underwent its first major sale to, of all things, the Perfect Film and Chemical Corporation in New Jersey. Asterisk, 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 to many interesting things there. But what's important is that the famous Stan Lee, unbeknownst to much of comics fandom, they just didn't get it, actually stepped down as the head writer. Took on a role eventually of something called publisher, which was much more of the licensing and development and public relations guy. Marvel got bigger. It hired lots of people, and Roy Thomas was the editor-in-chief. Thomas was very, very ambitious in literary terms and hired good writers. I mean, really good dramatic dialogists and plotters, and kind of many of them very young. Threw them at the material, just hurled them at them. Steve Englehart, here, go write Doctor Strange. Steve Gerber, go and write this weirdness, and because it's weird, because it's Steve Gerber. And then, Jerry Conway, half Stan Lee's age at that time. Here, you got Spider-Man, go. Marvel was just falling apart at the seams with young, idealistic, or bitter, or otherwise really, really free writers. Jim Starlin. It goes on and on. Doug Monk, Don McGregor, tons of others. And so we've got all that happening. And then over at DC at exactly the same time, as part of National Periodical Publications, had gone public in 1961. 1968, a huge sale is completed, and Warner Communications, of which DC Comics is that much, is formed. And Warner Communications, of course, is a behemoth then and now. And what's kind of interesting is that as opposed to Marvel, which was kind of an underground comics company jumped up, into prominence, here we have this piece of a behemoth, which has been ever since Superman Incorporated, or whatever it was called back in the 40s, started, has always been part of the larger media machine. But for once, there's this huge editorial shakeup with the new owners, and they get an editor-in-chief for DC who is one of the artists, Carmine Infantino. So, poof, after decades of, editors, specific editors, people like Julius Schwartz, on and on, famous names, Weisinger, Fassbinder, those guys are aged and gone, and Carmine Infantino, an artist of all things, as editor-in-chief, who also goes to town hiring up the joint. And that's where, first of all, he lands Kirby and Ditko from Marvel. He also has people like Neil Adams and a wide variety of other, great artists and long-term writers, Archie Goodwin, Frank Robbins, lots of people who really know what they're doing in comics. So they go to town too. So during this period, the comics just go completely crazy. The writers are actually writing forward. They're not paying attention to one bit of the franchise expectations of comic books. They're completely off the leash. And this is the period where most of the trenchant content, the stuff that's been reworked again and again and then mined for new dramatic purposes, all these years, this is where it kicks in. All of a sudden, we've got a revival of Batman as the Dark Avenger of the Night, but still under the eye of the Comics Code, which still had a few more years to run in its older form. And so they can't make him pack heat like he did back in 1939. So he's a dark avenger of the night, but anti-gun. Can't do guns. Guns bad. So, there's Dennis O'Neil trying to write this, and he comes up with this sort of mentally completely twisted Batman. And it's a complete artifact of having that freedom to write and do the revival, but also be constrained by the code. And so you end up with Batman being weird. Okay, cue 50 years of interesting Batman stories. Jerry Conway, says, you know what? I don't think Gwen's right for Peter. I'm going to knock her off. Who told him to do that? Nobody. There was no editorial meeting. They didn't plan it with the crossover. None of that stuff. So things just go really berserk, and you get all sorts of great stuff. Luke Cage strides onto the scene, not as anybody's guest star either. Jon Stewart, explodes onto the screen or the pages. All kinds of fascinating, different approaches appear. I would track it, of course, back to the Fantastic Four, but even, or at least as much so, to the original early Doom Patrol, which had the same creative team for its entire run and is brilliant. Going to that, going to the greatest work on the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man, then moving up into the freakier and the more, sort of socially driven stuff over the next decade. Basically, ownership of Marvel comes to its senses. It's gone through a couple of more twists and turns, and instates editorship to basically knock all this crap off and, get things back down, codify things, get it nice and settled so we know what's going on. We plan for what's going to happen, and we link the toys to the superheroes and quit messing around. So Marvel kind of undergoes a number of paroxysms. They don't really finally settle. It never quite works until much later. It's kind of like the horses were out in the, out of the corral, and Marvel kind of bumps from conformist and safe writing to occasional kicking up the traces writing all the way through the 80s. But DC comes to its corporate senses in the late 70s as well, and basically, removes Infantino and locks things down again, and again settles into a much more controlled, managerial approach toward this franchise, of which the comics are a piece. They make the slight error of hiring a bunch of anarchists from the UK and related areas, and so they come over and cause their own brand of trouble and kick up the traces too, but that's DC's 80s story. So hopefully some of you are recognizing some of this, but think of it. Think of that period using the wonderful sort of underground or undercover material from the early 60s and then booming in 1968 and running like gangbusters through 1978. And this is the era of comics that the authors of Champions drew upon. They thought about writing forward, which is to say, playing forward. Here's where we are. Here's what we got. It looks like this. It looks like this. These problems are going on. Do it. What happens? Okay, next session. What happened? All right, now here's here and here's there. And they're going to do, okay, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Well, then this happens. What happens? And the notion of the planned campaign, looking ahead, very much as if you were planning Secret Wars or later the death of Superman or something like that. That creeps into Champions culture. You can even see it, battling it out. This supplements like this and that supplements like that. There's different GM and story approaches kind of battling it out in the supplements. But more than any other game, there was more support for that play forward. The GM is adapting to what just happened just as much as the players are. And we don't have the franchise in mind. We don't have the epic in mind, or you have thoughts about the awesomeness, but you are in the awesomeness and things are going to change. 4 issues down the road, your sort of planned awesomeness is looking real different now. So I'm not necessarily saying it's winging it every single issue. I mean, authors were thinking about through lines and stuff, but they weren't necessarily thinking in terms of managing it all and making it happen. They can see again and again the writer kind of does a swerve based on what they're thinking about what just happened now. So, with all that in mind, I'm looking at what is a hero in that era of comics, and that's where you find your most defiant personalities and your most neurotic, head scratchies. All of the stuff that you might think of as like dark and twisted and neurotic and, modern and not, comics grow up kind of stuff like Watchmen, all that's fine, but its roots are earlier. Its roots are in this material. It's not actually, the late 80s that did it. So Champions is the superhero game that captures that and says, we're writing forward and we don't know what a hero is. We are in crisis, social crisis, psychological crisis, immediate physical crisis, all kinds of things. And the villains sometimes are pretty much in the same boat as the heroes as far as this is concerned. And we find out what being a hero is by doing. So anyway, this was this big old long talk, and it was all full of comics geekery and stuff like that, which is good. I want to ask you, hello, backers. I would like to ask you, in play, and I don't mean in your head thinking about play, or in comics, and I don't mean TV, film, any derivative or adapted form, but the comics. So either in play at the table or in the comics themselves. Everybody, tell me one example of when you really felt it. You said, that is heroic. That is my hero. And I'm very open to the idea that it may not match anything like some dictionary or literary definition of hero at all. I know people who look at sort of the torture scenes of Dark Knight Returns and say, there it is. That's my guy. That's my hero. So whatever it may be, I ask you to be honest about it. Tell me what they are. Let's see some comments. Because I think this is the game that can get you there.